Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session of conversations with TEDx speakers at UCLA. We are so excited to continue this new format of TEDxUCLA as a response to COVID-19 and not being able to have our conference this year. Today, we have a really exciting talk with Dr. Andrea Letamendi. But before we get started and let her take the floor, we want to go ahead and give you some more insight as to how today is going to run. First, we'll go ahead and give Andrea about 15 minutes to tell us her big idea. And after those 15 minutes, we're going to have the opportunity for you all to ask questions and engage with our speaker. So I'm going to go ahead and let my colleague Josh explain how the chat's going to work.
Hey folks, welcome so much to our fifth edition of TEDxUCLA Conversations. We are so grateful to have Andrea. We want to hear from you. So folks, right now, we've got 55 people in our chat right now. Tell us where you're from in the chat right now. Just tell us where you are currently located so we can make sure that the chat is working right now. What we're going to do as we move forward is we will be allowing you to engage in this chat as much as you'd like. I'm looking around. We've got a ton of people from LA, Long Beach. We've got folks in Marina del Rey, New York. Hey, New York. And San Diego, Quebec City, hello, Palm Springs, and Chicago, and Jackson, Mississippi, and Washington. Good Lord, we've got people from all over, so welcome and thank you so much for joining us. Throughout this entire session, we want the conversation to continue in the chat. As questions come up, if there's conversation between Carlo and Andrea that intrigue you or you have a question, jump into the chat, ask that question, and then we are going to be peppering Andrea with those questions as we move through. So Carlo, back to you.
Thanks, Josh. And if you have any reflections or any reactions as well, please feel free to share that on the chat. It's also an opportunity for you all to engage with each other. Great, thanks, Josh, again. Andrea, welcome. We're happy to have you again. I know this is, I think, 5 years since you were involved with TEDx, so happy 5-year anniversary. Yeah, I want to go ahead and give you the floor to tell us a little more about your story. You're going to be talking about the healing power of stories and parasocial relationships, something that I know nothing about, but really intrigued to learn more about. So go ahead and take it away for us.
It's so great to be here and to share this conversation with everybody. I'm so excited to talk about this topic, and this is one that's really potentially personal for people, and so I'm excited to jump right in and talk about something that hopefully will resonate for some folks. But maybe not everyone here knows about the concept of parasocial relationships and what that means, so I'll be sure to identify and define some of those concepts. The first thing I want to do is ask folks to do a little mental time traveling with me and go back about 1 year. Actually, almost exactly a year ago, at the end of April, beginning of May, a couple of important pop culture events were happening. One was the end of Game of Thrones. This was a show that was on since 2011. In 2019, the last episode of the series hit us and hit us hard. It was an emotional, tumultuous roller coaster of a show. And right after, or right around that time, actually I think it was right before that time, another culmination happened in our pop culture, and that was the movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe called Avengers Endgame. And this was essentially an 11-year journey that culminated with the defeat of Thanos and the end of many of our superheroes' journeys. And as these events were happening, it was around this time that people were messaging me and calling me up and outreaching and saying, like, I'm having a difficult time. This is emotionally so personal. This is a roller coaster. This is difficult for me. This is challenging for me. And I started to kind of wonder, like, why are these events particularly challenging and difficult for people? And what is it about these stories in particular? And I realized that for these, there was a level of longevity related to these stories. That for Game of Thrones, this was a show that had been around for several seasons. for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we were on this adventure for more than 10 years. And so we had been vicariously with these amazing narratives and with these characters, and we're seeing these things come to an end. And frankly, seeing characters meet their deaths. And I realized that this was a time that we could really harness our understanding of these stories and how we can kind of bridge the fiction world or fictional worlds to our real life experiences. And shortly after, just months later, another big pop culture event happened, and it was the release of Episode 9 in Star Wars. This is the Rise of Skywalker film, which for many of us was a lifelong culmination, an ending of decades of stories. And so much was associated with that story. So much was kind of writing on how this would end. And, again, people were outreaching and saying, this is, either I'm joyful, this is exciting. Someone actually messaged me and said, I feel seen. I feel like my story is finally being told. And then others were saying to me, I'm disappointed. I am let down. I'm angry. I'm full of rage, and I don't understand how to process this. So many folks may be familiar with the work that I do, but as a psychologist, I try to occupy the space between fiction and the real world. And what I try to do is just better understand how these fictional stories, how storytelling and media can help us learn about psychology, and how these stories can even empower us psychologically. And so one of the first things I wanted to think about and perhaps introduce today was what those initial feelings were. So initially, one of those main reactions that we have that I just want to name, that hopefully people relate to, is this concept of surprise and disappointment. As we follow these stories, many times we don't know what's around the bend, and we don't know which characters survive, which characters meet their deaths, or which characters are kind of written in a way that we did not expect. So these emotions of being surprised, of being disappointed, and even the sense of grief and loss is something that I want to name as real feelings. Despite the fact that these characters and narratives aren't real, the reactions that we have are absolutely real. And that's one of the first things I just wanted to name, was that many of us do have that recognition. And what I wanted to better explore, especially after these events, was that many of us were experiencing these two things. One was, wow, I feel a strong emotion about this. But the other reaction was, I don't know what to do with this feeling. I don't know if I should talk about it. If I do talk about it, will I be judged? If I talk about it, will other people understand? And those are the areas that I think can really help us form some really helpful skills and insights, and even some self-betterment around emotional intelligence. And again, what I try to do is invite people into that intersection of fiction and reality to help us be able to learn a little bit more about these emotions and our processes. And so I think that what's helpful too, Carlo, you mentioned this concept of parasocial relationships. And I want to make sure to really kind of explore that paradigm and invite people to think about that intersection a little bit more. A parasocial relationship is a very personal connection to a fictional character. And this connection is non-delusional, meaning that we absolutely know that those characters are not real. So Rey from Star Wars, or Luke Skywalker, or Iron Man, we know that these characters do not exist. Nonetheless, the connections that we have to those fictional characters are what's real. That relationship that we begin to form with those characters are real. And the way that we process and react to those narratives are not only real experiences, but ones that can give us helpful vicarious learning. And I can give a few examples of that. One is this concept of resilience. Many folks are familiar with resilience and the idea that we can grow out of trauma or adversity, that we can learn from failure, we can learn from setbacks. And there's actually a psychological term called post-traumatic growth. And this refers to our ability to not only withstand and endure something really difficult, but to be able to understand how we're different from that, from the experience, and harness development, insight, and growth, and even purpose from that. So as I mentioned, if you were to watch real trauma and real hardship, it's incredibly difficult for us to do that. It's something that might be too triggering or too close to us. But if we experience these narratives and these stories in a way that's kind of distant from our experience, like through fantasy, through comics, through sci-fi, through the Marvel Cinematic Universe, whatever it is you're watching, then you actually get an ability to get a little bit more close to that concept and learn something from that. And there is a real term to this that exists in the psychological field. It's called psychological distancing. So right now we're all talking about social distancing and physical distancing, and it's, you know, heavy in our minds about how we're protecting ourselves and the people we care about from this, virus. And I know right now this pandemic is on our minds. It's actually recommended that we engage in something called psychological distancing. And many folks who follow the Happiness Lab or who are familiar with the research that comes out of Yale understand that this is an intentional process, or could be a vicarious process that happens when we're engaging with our media. So psychological distancing is kind of what it sounds like. Our ability to be involved in a story or consume information when it's not about us directly. So of course, when we think about pop culture, we think about fictional stories, there is a safety regarding it. There's almost this, you know, I often refer to it as a safety net. And that safety net gives us, it allows us a sense of support, a sense of comfort, and then a little bit of vulnerability, because the things that are being talked about and portrayed do hint at our real experiences. I have a couple of examples of in these stories of what this could look like. So I mentioned Endgame. With Endgame, we experience something that's pretty supernatural. It's a time travel story. And so all our superheroes band together and plan this journey to go back in time and collect these important stones. Now the story is actually quite complex because it goes back a decade, but what I really want to emphasize about that is the aspect of the sci-fi nature, of the supernatural nature, kind of pulls us in and lets us vicariously go along with the story. But what happens, and actually what the directors mentioned was intentional, is that the characters go to actual time points in their lifespans, time points in their histories that are traumatic, that are grief-filled, that are considered hardships for them. And so as they gear up to go on this journey, you know, they kind of stare at each other and realize we're about to do something really risky. We're about to do something that's going to be painful, going to emotionally hurt. And yet they band together and decide this is worth it, because what we need to get to, what the outcome will be, is healing from this huge global social threat. And they end up going to these places back in time. And I share why it's important for us to be on this journey with them, because often this is what we need to do when we consider how we overcome our own hardship and our actual trauma. We do need to process what our histories look like and actually pinpoint when these difficult challenges were experienced. So, if I were to ask you to do that, I think there would be potentially some reluctance, maybe some hesitancy. But to learn and process how this happens with these fictional characters gives us a little insight into how powerful and how healing this kind of time travel journey could be. And so that's what I mean by, that's just one example of psychological distancing, this sense of taking enough space, enough figurative distance from these characters, but how to harness some of those emotional reactions and process some of those emotional reactions in our real experiences.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Andrea. I'm still triggered by the ending of Game of Thrones, to be completely honest, and I'm sure that a lot of people on this chat are as well. But I'm particularly intrigued at the three concepts that you mentioned in the description of your talk, which are like insight, emotional growth, and self-discovery. So can you talk a little bit more about how these parasocial relationships can help us develop in these three concepts?
Absolutely. The concept of psychological distancing, which I mentioned, is how we kind of gain a little bit more awareness of ourselves through these stories. Also gives us the sense of insight. And so when I talk about self-awareness and insight, I'm referring to our ability to connect to a character and understand, that their story might be different than ours, but also to identify some of the aspects of their journey that are similar to ours. I can share that with Star Wars, the character Rey was one that I think was really empowering for some women, especially in this pop cultural fandom around Star Wars, where we were starting to see this unfolding of a young woman who was looking for her purpose and looking for her identity. And what was really powerful about her story throughout her journey is that she didn't have this, I'm mindful of spoilers, but throughout her journey, she didn't have a sense of her origins, where she came from, and she was surrounded by this concept of the Jedi identity being about legacy. And as I tuned into her story and as I connected with other fans, especially young women, they shared that really resonated for them, this concept that they did not have to access some important aspects of their own heritage, their sense of where they came from, this idea that a legacy would give them the opportunities and the identity that they were searching for. And, I took that concept and further connected that to the identity of someone who's first gen, who may be, surrounded by others or encounter this academic educational space and see that they may not look like, they may not have the same experiences as others in that context. So Rey, as a reminder, didn't have, traditional Jedi training, whereas Ben Solo had Luke Skywalker was his mentor. Like, he had the best Jedi training. He was exposed to some of the most, high level authority when it comes to his education. Whereas someone like Rey is discovering her powers and searching for what that means for her, and realizes that she can find herself in her own internal resources, that she doesn't have to rely on legacy to secure identity and to secure self-actualization. So to your question, when we think about concepts of self-awareness and concepts of our identity, often we look to these fictional characters to place ourselves, to explore some of these concepts that could be challenging for us, that could be a springboard, could launch us into this process of self-awareness and emotional growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I see the benefits, especially for folks who may not traditionally see their own identities or selves be represented in these stories, right? So thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Josh now. I see that the chat is really popular right now, and I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to kind of pose their questions to you. So Josh, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, hey folks, thank you so much. Wow, we need Drea every week. The chat is on fire this week. Clearly people are resonating. I do want to introduce my colleague as well, Scott Hutchinson. He and I are both monitoring the chat right now. You know, it's funny, and I'm going to ask all of our 79 participants, what show are you connecting to right now? You can drop it in the chat right now. Before, the four of us and Nathan, the five of us, were chatting about what shows we are connected to, and then we went on this whole conversation. So Karen's watching The Arrow and The Flash, and oh gosh, they're all going to come in. So they're all flying in right now. But
look
Drea,
what you did, Josh.
I know. No, this is great. Anybody watching Succession on HBO, I've gotten a great connection to that cast, and I don't know these people. And Drea and I have these conversations quite often. But you know, Drea, a lot of questions are coming in right now about characters that people are getting really connected to. Arlene and Kelly and Kieran were all talking about, why do we have these experiences to people that we don't know? And why do we resonate with some characters and we don't resonate with others? With a final question of, what can these experiences, what can our own individual experiences, feelings, and emotions with these television, theater, books teach us about our own lives? And I am loving this list because I want to let everybody know I have finished Netflix completely during this quarantine. And for those that are not living in Los Angeles, we were just extended until the end of July. So I need to watch all of this that you are putting in right now. So I thank you. This is kind of my own personal playlist as well. But Drea, talk to us about why we get so connected to these folks, why we become so connected to these fictional or non-fictional characters, and what can that teach us about our own life, emotions, and our own feelings?
Well, I certainly want to relate that to what a lot of us are experiencing right now. This pandemic has introduced a lot of elements related to our uncertainty, our stress, our sometimes anxiety about what the future will look like. And I think we turn to stories for different reasons. I'm noticing some of us are turning to stories that they're familiar with. So going back and binging Friends or Battlestar Galactica, or shows that we've actually seen several times, but in watching those shows or in those movies, it's almost as if we're searching for a sense of comfort, that we're looking for familiarity, we're looking for a sequence of events that we can predict, something that we almost feel like we have control over. And I think that's important to highlight, that a lot of us are just looking for that security and control. And media, especially pop culture, and pop culture that we have a pre-existing relationship with, is going to give us that sense of comfort. I mentioned Friends. One of the first studies around parasocial relationships happened with the show Friends. Many of us remember when that show ended. A lot of us were kind of sad, like, what's going to happen? Where are those stories going to end up? And to experience those journeys end and know that we're going to miss them was something that we all kind of collectively felt. So the study that looked at Friends wanted to kind of like capture those emotions. And they actually found that the emotions that people experience at the end of the series finale were very similar to ones we experience in our actual real losses or after actual losses. So feelings like sadness, feelings like confusion and anger, feelings around grief and loss, those emotions were captured and shared by viewers. Now it's interesting because our relationship with those stories kind of continues on. And so when we go back and watch them, maybe there's some need for comfort and familiarity when we go back to those stories. Now, I'm also noticing another trend. People are watching a lot of dystopian stuff and like apocalyptic, really rough things. That has a spectrum, right? Right now I'm watching Ozark, which is, one scary thing after the other that this family's experiencing. But some people are actually interested in global pandemics. They're interested in watching Contagion. They want to see World War Z. They want to see The Walking Dead. That interest, I think, is similar to this connection to wanting a wanting to delve further into something that is causing us anxiety and fear, but in a way that we're controlling. Because if we've seen it before, we know how it ends. But we also are looking for a sequence that gives us a sense of finality. These stories have a beginning, middle, and end. And so we know that the finality and kind of the containment of that story is one that our brains can process and actually feel a level of comfort around. We're looking for answers, and media can give us some of those answers. Now, when it comes to, Josh, I think you asked, how our emotions can then teach us more about ourselves, or how these relationships can teach us more about ourselves. And I think that's really important to highlight here, because we're talking not just about how we love these stories and we're binging these stories. There are a couple things that I want to highlight that that really are connecting between that fictional world and the real world. I mentioned a little bit about resilience and post-traumatic growth. I think also when we surround ourselves in these stories and we watch and witness the resilience of these characters, we also begin to form within ourselves similar emotions around a sense of hope for the future, around a sense of endurance, and around these concepts of emotional tenacity. So I mentioned earlier that, last year around this time, we were grieving and processing all these strong emotions related to Endgame. Never did we predict that we would be in the situation that we're in now. And so I'm not at all saying that watching Endgame is going to help us through this pandemic, but I am saying that it was definitely helpful to learn how and vicariously understand how characters face difficult challenges and overcome those challenges. So I really am stretching this idea, but I do think that really leads to our ability to practice some of this emotional intelligence. When we're watching Endgame or Game of Thrones or some of these things that people are mentioning here in the chat room, this is really good for our emotional growth, because these are these moments where we're practicing. How does that feeling work? How does that feeling feel in my body? What am I going to do when that feeling happens again? And so I would argue that a lot of us who have processed those feelings individually and with each other have a little bit more of an understanding of what it's like to experience those challenges and the pain ourselves in these real experiences. And the second thing that I want to mention about this is how it brings us together. And so last year I noticed that people were reaching out and they weren't saying, hey, I need to talk to you about this. They were saying, like, can we gather in a room? Can we all get together? Can we talk collectively about what's happening to these characters and how we're reacting? And I think that is one of the other outcomes that's really positive about our relationships with pop culture. I can tell you, even stories that are not necessarily fictional, like, for those of you watching 90 Day Fiancé, how many text messages did I get about Lana on Sunday? Like, we were just actively connecting and talking about this story. So I just really want to highlight and celebrate the ability for stories to get us into a similar mindset and connect us and give us this opportunity to get together emotionally and to connect with one another. That piece I often call an acceleration of connection. That the moment, someone sees I'm wearing a Star Wars shirt, the moment I meet someone else who, has feelings about The Last Jedi or Rise of Skywalker, this shared fandom is an acceleration of connection. And immediately there's something that person and I can talk about. And maybe those discussions can get real. Maybe those discussions can get into the difficulty of processing what happened to Kylo or to Rey, or how that film either, could have made us feel excited about how it ended, but for many of us, huge disappointment about how that narrative ended. And then how do we share that disappointment with one another, and what does it mean for some of us who felt not seen, not visible, or even, not cared about by the fiction. And that brings me to a third idea, which is our relationship with fiction and the fictional relationship with us. This idea that a movie like that didn't care about me or my feelings. How can I come to that conclusion? How can I even make this statement that a fictional character disappointed me? And so, again, I want to emphasize that, yes, I understand that these are not real individuals and not real people. Well, Lana might be real, but these fictional characters are not real. But the reactions I have, the emotional responses that I have, I just really want to validate that those are real. And when we connect with one another, that becomes a way for us to then share what's real with one another.
Andrea, I want to ask a question. I really love looking at this chat as you're talking. Marika asked a question. When does it become unhealthy? When do these connections, in this case, she's asking about television characters, but it could be a lot of different things, become unhealthy? And I see down from Latonia mentioned her 92-year-old grandmother is on an action thriller binge. At what point does it become unhealthy, and what are the characteristics of it being unhealthy?
That's a great point. I think we always need to consider how our consumption of media could be unhealthy for us. And that's a very broad thing, what I just said. How we're consuming our social media, how we're consuming news media and fictional media. I think that's always important to touch base with and kind of check in with one another and ourselves around. Is this relationship toxic? Like, how does this relationship make me feel? And I think that is, I'll say a couple of things about that. One is that, anything that is extreme, anything that that doesn't allow us to have some sense of control over, I think that can be unhealthy. There's a term that people may be familiar with, and it's called problem-focused coping. So I mentioned consuming media as a way that might help our mental health in some way. So for instance, how watching something like Friends could give us a sense of calmness and familiarity during what could be a really stressful and difficult time. Now, some of us may use that coping in more problem-focused ways. In other words, what if we're completely disconnected with real people and we're only hyper-focused on fictional media? What if we're hyper-focused on news media and that just generates more and more anxiety and stress? So I think anything that's extreme and could potentially be toxic for our mental health is really likely going to be problematic and potentially could lead to further issues. So I think, just like anything, even though I'm celebrating these relationships and these connections to fiction, I also really want to invite people to take it that step further. It's not just that relationship we have with our fiction, but how did that then bridge? I'm kind of trying to occupy the space between the real and fiction, and how do I make that bridge? What is this teaching me? What can I take from it? And then how can I be a different person because of it?
Well, Drea, the chat is blowing up. And Arlene asked a really interesting question of, do we have an unconscious sense of selection bias of why some popular cultural icons resonate more than others? For example, Arlene said they never really got into the Harry Potter series, but others really did, or Star Wars. I'll admit I am not a Star Wars fan. I haven't seen it. Please don't kill me in the chat. I'll watch it this weekend. But why do we have this? Oh, and there they go. But why do we have this bias with who really resonates and who doesn't?
Well, I just want to name something that just happened right now. You are aware that not knowing about Star Wars could potentially lead to a little judgment, maybe criticism. But I think this is also a moment. This is a process and an interaction with fandom that we're all kind of working through. it's important for us to understand why that criticism might happen. Why are people mad at you for not knowing, Josh? Why don't you know about Star Wars? And why does that make me upset and angry? So I think that allows us to get a little bit, again, using the safety of fiction, get a little bit more closer to concepts like perception taking, maybe understanding that not everyone likes the same things that we like, and also a little bit of gatekeeping and out-group, in-group functioning happening here, where simply because you did not enter the fandom of Star Wars, there's already some expectations around you. And I think especially with some of these longer enduring fandoms, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Game of Thrones, there are these carried ideas and expectations around the people that follow them and the people that don't. But I think those are opportunities to, and I see people listing which house they are in Pottermore. I'm a bit of a hybrid. I think I'm a Ravenclaw, but every test I take calls me a Hufflepuff. I don't get it. There's a support group for those of us who are missorted into Hufflepuff, I think. But Josh, to get at your question, I think I do want to say, we often, with the media, we're looking for something important to our identity and important to some of our needs. And so when I share that, I think some of these stories that have resonated for a lot of us have those elements. In Harry Potter, Star Wars, Game of Thrones, a lot of this is about the need to understand oneself and place our identities in our sociocultural world. Where do I belong? How do I matter? Will I be accepted for my authentic self? Some of us are still going through that journey and exploring our sense of selves and our placement in our real world. And so we've got to watch how it happens. How does Luke Skywalker figure this out? How does Rey come from nothing, ostensibly, and become one of the most powerful Jedi in the universe? I need to see that. I need to understand how to empower myself and access my own internal resources. And sometimes I need these fictional worlds to really kind of give me that emphasis, give me that launch pad to really strive for some of these things. The other thing that I think is important to mention is the marginalization and the invisibility of some of our identities in both places, right? So in the real world, just having the opportunity to be seen and heard and to place ourselves in society is a struggle. As we, I can't help but place ourselves in this pandemic as well, as we manage social distancing and our health and care for one another. These social gaps and, frankly, the oppression is more amplified. And so I think even now, as we're looking toward media and trying to find our stories, we're looking for visibility. We're looking for purpose. We're looking for a story that tells us that we matter. And so that, I think, is an extremely universal experience. It doesn't even have to be the sci-fi, pop culture, Star Wars, comic book stuff. That could be almost any story that resonates with you. And I think that could be probably one of the most common reasons, to answer your question, that we're sort of biased for some of these stories.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and thank you for allowing me to not like Star Wars. Kieran, I apologize. Everyone else in the chat, I apologize. I've tried. Olivia York asked a really interesting question. Do you think that our disappointment and our hardships with the endings of these stories, for example, Game of Thrones, is related to our own psychology, wishing that our success is a reflection of theirs, and if their stories didn't end well, potentially ours might not as well. What is your reading on our disappointment with these endings in the reflection of our own personal psychology?
That's a really lovely question, because I think it pertains to the previous one and the expectation that if I can't actualize my story in real life, can I see it and live it in some vicarious way through a fictional narrative? I think in talking about characters that we connect with, I do feel like the deaths of characters, the loss of characters, and the oppression of characters that we relate to can make us feel a certain way and react a certain way. So I know that certainly, especially in shows that have celebrated certain identities and then wrote characters off or even killed characters, there's this experience or conclusion that, you know, does society really care about someone like me? Does this culture find me to be expendable in the way that this story found that character to be expendable? So many turn to, you know, as I talk about this vaguely, I can be more specific in naming that the stories that highlight and celebrate LGBTQ characters in their narrative and then traumatize, oppress, and kill them in their narrative have repercussions and outcomes for individuals who identify and really connect with those characters, and then feel like that those endings and those outcomes really impact the way that they internalize that narrative and that experience. And it does have a parallel, right? We think about this concept: should fiction, should pop culture, should sci-fi, should Star Trek, should Star Wars tell us about how we are aspirationally? Is this how society should be? Or is this merely a reflection of the existing paradigms, oppressions, differences, disparities that we're experiencing in our real world? And I think it can be both. I don't think it's one or the other.
Well, Andrea, Bat threw out a really interesting question as well. What does it say about us if we like the unhappy endings? What if we are actually supporting the villain and wanting the villain to win? What may that say about our own psychological self?
Great question. So when the Joker film came out, maybe fall of last year, that raised a lot of questions around this, these confusing feelings about villains, and what if we root for the villain, and what if these really tragic, unhappy endings are ones that we're sort of interested in and curious about. And as a psychologist, I think it's really important for us to explore and examine our relationship to those stories. It doesn't always mean, and in fact, most times, it does not mean that we want to emulate that behavior, that we condone it, that we are celebrating violence or murder or hatred. I think that we as humans have a curiosity around, especially around villains, because we're not perfect. We make mistakes. We say bad things once in a while. We hurt other people's feelings. In fact, we have setbacks. And in fact, there are parts of us that are villainous. I think that's human nature. And to really see, certainly in an extreme way, characters that embody those bad things, I think it can be somewhat healing, and it can offer growth for us, because we're able to accept those parts of ourselves, and we're able to, in a very healthy way, see how these stories pan out. It almost kind of like helps us with that curiosity and helps us see how these outcomes could be pretty tragic. And I think it's okay to enjoy that once in a while.
Andrea, I'm personally intrigued to dive a little bit deeper and know, what is the neurobiological process of all of these things? What's happening in our brains when we are forming these connections, so on and so forth?
That's a great question. And I really want to connect that to the context of what a lot of us are experiencing right now in this global pandemic. And the reason I'm doing that is that we've been getting some pretty clear orders, right? Even there's even been this paradigm we've been asked to follow. Do these 5 things: 6 feet distance, wash your hands, wear a mask. There's been these recommendations that come from medical experts about how to keep our bodies safe. And as humans, we react really well to concrete instructions like that. So as I've been exploring psychological health in regards to a crisis like this, I've been talking about how to transfer that paradigm to psychological health as we endure all these hardships and adjustments. In other words, could there be a concrete paradigm that will help us stay healthy mentally? And it turns out that in the coping literature, there are 5 things that we're asked to think about. And I actually want to connect these to media and to your question about neurobiology. These 5 things include achieving a sense of safety, finding ways to be calm, gaining self-efficacy, which is a sense of your own control, social connectedness, and a sense of hope about the future. And I truly believe that we can achieve those things. They're not as concrete as washing your hands. That's the first thing I'll say. Like, these are a little bit more ambitious, right? But I do think that we can achieve those goals and keep focus on these really important recommendations through media. So how does that work? Well, in achieving a sense of safety, what does that really mean? For me, it means psychological safety. Am I in a place where I can find calmness? I can achieve a physical and mental state of peace. Well, I mentioned some shows that people go to that they're familiar with, and maybe some media connections that actually do physiologically give us a sense of calmness. That could be because the familiarity gives us a spike in dopamine and serotonin. Those are the feel-good chemicals in our brain. It could be that as we're consuming media, we're also connecting with someone close to us. We're chatting with them, we're texting with them. I mean, Carlo, your reaction when I said Lana from 90 Day Fiancé was amazing. So, already, again, this acceleration of connection and going towards something that can make us feel good is neurobiologically healthy. I also mentioned finding ways to be calm, and I really mean that. Like, how do we regulate our bodies? How do we regulate our emotions? And I think that especially when we don't have access to other people and being able to hug one another and connect with one another physically, we can find some of these familiar and comforting experiences in media. And then, I mentioned a sense of hope about the future. And I think that is probably one of the most powerful ways in which media can offer us some of those feelings, some of those aspirational ideas. And again, that can come from, incredible, fantastical, supernatural stories that just really inspire us to go out there and be better and be different and aspire for improvement. Or it could be something a little bit more subtle. Maybe there's a show, a TV series, or a film that is a smaller story that allows just this connection of reminding us what's important to us. That gets me to the value system that we hold very dear within ourselves. What is that value system, and how is the media allowing us to harness those feelings that are very important to us and keep us connected to our sense of self?
Thank you for that clarification. Andrea, we've talked about how parasocial relationships and these stories can help us navigate our own emotional growth, self-discovery, and how this could potentially help in our real life relationships. So what does this say about the ways in which we can engage with our community as a large, right? Like, what are the communal benefits that may come from these relationships?
That's a wonderful bridge that is really important to me. Clearly, one of the first steps here is talking about fictional stories and narratives that aren't real and that many of us are connecting to, and maybe they're ones that help us connect with one another. But really, I think what's exciting about the fictional narrative and these stories is its ability for us to build community. How are the lessons we're learning, how are the ideas that get introduced to us through these stories going to help us really build a cultural society that is healing and hopeful and welcoming to everybody? And that sounds like a utopia, but I really am pointing to these ideas that perhaps as we're learning more about ourselves and what's important to us, we then begin to bridge those values to other people in our community. I mentioned, for instance, that a character like Ray could help inspire me to understand that what's important to me is self-efficacy. What's important to me is visibility and having a place in my culture and in my in my community. And I know then that there must be others that feel the same way, that they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to also place themselves. And so how do we then find one another? How are we able to bridge that fictional lesson, that fictional aha moment into a personal and social aha moment where we're beginning to realize that these are shared experiences. And I mentioned the acceleration of a connection that may be one-to-one. I accelerate a connection between one other person. But I also believe that we can accelerate connections on a larger horizon, that we can accelerate those connections in much bigger ways.
That's beautiful. Thank you. We have one last question before we ask you for your final thoughts and wrap-ups. So Penny, saying you've been talking about stories what stories have provided for us. There was a time when people created and acted out their own stories. As a culture, have we stepped backwards?
I don't think we've stepped backwards. I really think that's an important process to think about, which is mainly we've been talking about consuming other people's stories and witnessing other people's stories. And if I'm understanding this question correctly, this is really pointing out the importance of writing our own narrative and telling our story. And how does that fit? If I'm vicariously experiencing a narrative or a journey and I don't feel like I'm a part of it, or I don't feel like I can actualize it in my own life, there's something really big missing. So hopefully I'm not misinterpreting the question, but I understand that to mean we also need to harness the importance of our own individual innovation and ingenuity in order for us to voice ourselves and tell our stories. They may not be written yet. They may not exist in these various fandoms, in these fictional worlds. And so, yes, I agree that it's absolutely important. I don't think we've stepped backwards, but I do think it's really important to be visible enough to be able to voice our own stories and have our stories told.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, so we have about 5 minutes left together. And so giving everything that we've talked about, giving all the things that the folks in our audience have mentioned in the chat, what would you want people to take away from their time with us today?
I wanted to actually read a quote from Neil Gaiman that I was reminded of the other day, and I think this is really hopefully underscoring this concept of parasocial relationships and how we grow and develop and gain insight from pop culture. And he said, "Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten." And for me, this really resonates because, again, the content may not be as important as the lessons and the experiences learned from the narrative. And so that's what I want to end with.
Thanks for that quote, Drea. I've personally been so engaged having you here with us and kind of getting all these feelings about these shows and the relationships that I've built with characters. And I know that so many people on the chat have also had that opportunity. I know some folks were saying that they were getting emotional seeing how people were connecting with each other based on the shows that they were watching. So thank you so much for being able to create this space in which people are able to connect with each other based on these shows and relationships that we built with fictional and non-fictional characters. I think it's something so special and not very common. So thank you again for that. We want to go ahead and let you all know that we will be continuing these sessions on a weekly basis. And also please check out our social media, TEDxUCLA, on Facebook and Twitter, and also Instagram for updates and to engage with us on a continuing basis. Any final thoughts, Josh and Scott?
No, just thank you so much. And yeah, please consider joining us next week with Kitty Feldy, former NPR broadcaster, and does a lot of work around stories and children. So I think you'll enjoy that. And Drea, we will capture this Zoom and chat and push it up to the website. I'm thrilled that you did this, and I really enjoyed all the questions and conversation on chat.
Drea, before you leave, everyone wants to know, where did you get your shirt? There have been multiple requests for where you got your shirt. So we don't like to plug anybody, but everyone wants to know where you got your shirt.
I think this will make everyone sad to say this is one of the shirts I believe I got in the Disneyland park.
So when Disney reopens, everybody, please visit Disney and get your shirts. Well, hey, folks, thank you all so much for joining us today. Please feel free to follow us at TEDxUCLA. And Drea, we'll post Drea's contact on there as well. Drea, do you have a handle that you want to promote?
Sure. For folks who want to follow me on socials, at Arkham Asylum Doc is where you can find me. And then my website is where you can find all the things I write about and post videos about. That's drdreapsychology.com.
All right, Drea. Thank you all so much, and stay safe out there, folks.